Dietrich Bonhoeffer, A Call for Divine Peace. By Barry T. Burdick. Intro. The Uprising of Genocide and the Church's Role. Hitler and the Nazi regime remain one of the world's most potent and feared forces of our time. During World War II, they committed mass genocide, executing over 6 million people in terrifying concentration camps. Hitler's aggressive and violent dominance of Europe allowed the Third Reich to become a world power over a relatively short period of time. Following World War I, Hitler persuaded many Germans that Jews were to blame for their nation's economic woes. This was the beginning of the major Jewish oppression that would last through World War II. Few dared to speak out against Hitler and the twisted ideology that he was spreading throughout Europe. This deafening silence included the Christian Church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, however, would not remain silent and was willing to risk his life to protect the people of Germany, the Church, and to end anti-Semitic sentiment. The goals of this presentation. In this presentation, we will be exploring Bonhoeffer's ideas on peace ethics and the benefits when implemented in a unified Christian church. Through the examination of Bonhoeffer's work within the context of his time, we are offered a perspective into the foundation of his beliefs. Such work offers us a window of discovery that can potentially reveal a model of application in our cultural context. We will see the influence of the Christian Church's doctrine regarding ethical integrity and the horrendous events that can occur when misconstrued. We will see what happens when the Church's lack of agency of not following Bonhoeffer's model of peace ethics within the context of World War II. We will then explore his work in relationship to the horrendous act of genocide in Rwanda in 1994, and the potential dangers of such events happening again within our world today. We will see what happens when the Church is complacent in following such a model of peace ethic, that it inherently becomes the very agent of violence that it hopes to suppress. We will then ponder what can happen if the Church followed Bonhoeffer's model of peace ethics. As we will make the argument that if such a model is adopted by the Church, it could have prevented the horrific acts of genocide that took place. We will conclude by looking at Bonhoeffer's work as an instrument that can be used by the Church today in the prevention of such inhumane acts from reoccurring. Chapter 1. A brief account of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was born in Poland on February 4, 1906, and killed on April 9, 1945, at the Flossenburg concentration camp in Germany, for his efforts in the anti-Hitler resistance. At 14, Bonhoeffer declared his desire to become a priest and theologian. At the age of 21, he received his doctorate in theology from the University of Berlin. He then traveled throughout Spain and America, expanding on his academic knowledge of the Gospels and the Church's role in social justice. When he returned to Germany in 1931, Bonhoeffer accepted a position as a lecturer in systematic theology at the University of Berlin. He was ordained on November 15, 1931, at the age of 25, at Old Prussian United Street Matthew in Berlin Tiergarten. Bonhoeffer opposes Hitler. Only 2 days after Hitler's election as Chancellor, Bonhoeffer openly criticized him in a radio broadcast that was cut short in the middle of the production. This was especially brave and dangerous event, considering Hitler's growing popularity as a leader and the iron fist to which he ruled. Bonhoeffer was not only contradicting Hitler but also many other Germans that believed that the Jews were the reason for the nation's economic struggles. Bonhoeffer believed that it was the Church's responsibility to oppose Hitler's policies. However, there was a theological disagreement about what the Church's role should be. The debate over whether it should be a force of active resistance, which may be interpreted as mixing the Church and politics, versus being spiritually focused, which may be interpreted as an unnecessary obsession with personal purity. Bonhoeffer is deeply concerned with issues of God-related ethics, the relationship between Church and state, and the Christian's role of being an agent that resists the nationalization of the Church. What is a Bonhoeffer moment? People often mistakenly believe that a Bonhoeffer moment necessitates a violent response of resistance. To this point, many begin to examine Bonhoeffer's work from the perspective of the end result of his participation in the plot to assassinate Hitler. By engaging in his doctrinal work from this starting point, is inherently flawed and even dangerous. Using his work and life example as a way to justify one's motive of implementing violent acts of resistance intrinsically distorts the broad principles behind the ideals of his work. Rather than applying Bonhoeffer's known anecdotes to our contemporary conflicts, we would be better served by learning more about Bonhoeffer's vision of political life and the process of thought that underpins the detailed and sophisticated narrative of his work. As such, we will discover a method that will deepen our awareness of our call to action in the Church and therefore find the appropriate steps of resistance within our world today. Bonhoeffer's beliefs. In order for us to correctly engage with Bonhoeffer's thought, one must examine his theology and situate it within the broader framework of his political activity. One must examine his ideas on the Church's obligation regarding required acts of resistance. Bonhoeffer's idea of peace ethics offers us a critical insight into the dangers of the Church being an agent that promotes fascism rather than being a powerful vessel that boldly proclaims a gospel message that suppresses sentiments against all acts of violence. In his essay, Christ, Reality, and Good, Bonhoeffer began to articulate the foundation of his positions on Christian ethics by asserting that it must pivot away from traditional questions about being good and doing good, which presupposes the self and the world as ultimate realities, toward the question of God's will. Bonhoeffer affirms that the ultimate reality of God's will is revealed in Christ Jesus, too. Bonhoeffer asserts that Christians must carefully ponder, what is God's will? Rather than the traditional notions on Christian morality being measured by doing good. Bonhoeffer surprisingly asserts that it is not the Christian's purpose to improve the world through their efforts. Instead, its role is to manifest God's actuality and essence everywhere as the ultimate truth. Whereas God alone provides the ethical story of goodness revealed through the witness of Jesus Christ. Christ is the one who reveals God's truth. At the root of Christian morality as such, ethics cannot be characterized by the kingdom of nature but rather the kingdom of grace. Although the two realms rub up against each other, Bonhoeffer asserts that we only have the following options: either we place ourselves in one of the two realms, wanting Christ without the world, or the world without Christ, and in both cases, we deceive ourselves. Or we try to stand in the two realms simultaneously, thereby becoming people in eternal conflict, who ever and again present ourselves as the only form of Christian existence that is in accord with reality, too. Here, Bonhoeffer warns of the dangers of one being separated from God. They can no longer separate themselves in clerical pride from the world, too. As such, Bonhoeffer is directly addressing the dangers being presented by the Nazi regime. Yet, at the same time, he is also calling for unified action by the Church to be able to define, articulate, and proclaim the divine model of ethics. For Bonhoeffer, reconciliation in Christ is the ultimate reality. Participation in this reality is the true meaning of the question concerning the good. Here we find the pinnacle moment that established the applicable difference between ethics understood in the spiritual realm. That being, the kingdom of grace over the kingdom of nature. To summarize, the kingdom of grace defines our ethics as centered on sacrificial love. Whereas Christ has died for the world, and Christ is yet also present in the world. The body of Jesus Christ, especially as it is presented to us on the cross, made visible in faith through both the world in its sin and in its being loved by God, and the church community as the company of those who recognize their sin and gratefully submit to the love of God. He is masterly directing the church and the individual Christian's attention to their divine call and witness of being the follower of God that defines ethics through the sacrificial act of self. Although he asserts that the church is to be active in this world, Bonhoeffer also offers various limits and individual duties that separate the church and government in relationship to one another. He does affirm, however, that government has the God-given task of preserving the world for Christ. Bonhoeffer understands that the state shall conduct itself within a divine dignity. As such, within this divine mandate, the government should hold to strict limits regarding its power. Still, in the end, the state and the church shall act independently of each other, both following their divinely appointed commission. Plainly put, the two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, have two rulers. The first is ruled by the gospel, while a state governs the other under God's law. Bonhoeffer's peace ethics. During the World Alliance ecumenical meeting on the Danish island of Farno in the summer of 1934, Bonhoeffer called the Church to be unified as an institution that is grounded in the call to preach and follow God's commands. Bonhoeffer maintains that Christianity must be a unified church that understands itself as a distinct entity independent of the state's nationalist agendas. Bonhoeffer seeks to empower the Church to be centered on God's commandments and not a commodity that works with the state towards aggressions against governments, nations, or other groups or institutions. Bonhoeffer argues that it is critical to distinguish the Church from organizations directed by governmental agencies. He asserts in his writing, Farno Theses paper, and address, The Church and the Peoples of the World, the systematic energy regarding the doctrinal unity of the Church must be active in affirming and promoting the radical call for the Church, and all of its believers must be vocally engaged in upholding and proclaiming this message of divine peace. Bonhoeffer distinguishes that the Church is not to oppose the war in the same manner as government agencies. The Church shall not be engaging in social measures that seek peace from war through violent acts taken to oppose and restrain such conflicts. Bonhoeffer enumerates actions implemented by governmental agents to include treaties, financial investments, and universal peaceful rearmament. Bonhoeffer believes that worldly systems cannot lead toward peace because they go against God's divine will. Whereas he states, battles are won, not with weapons, but with God. They are won where the way leads to the cross. Which of us can say he knows what it might mean for the world if one nation should meet the aggressor, not with weapons in hand, but praying, defenseless, and for that very reason protected by a bulwark, or defensive wall, never failing. 2. Bonhoeffer also affirms that another issue why such worldly instruments used to establish peace will fail is because they confuse peace with safety. Here he states, there is no way to peace along the way to safety. For peace must be dared. It is a great venture. It can never be made safe. Peace is the opposite of security, too. Bonhoeffer continues to explain that peace means to give oneself altogether to the law of God, wanting no security but in faith and obedience laying the destiny of the nations in the hand of Almighty God, not trying to direct it for selfish purposes, 2. Bonhoeffer's peace ethics is to be lived by the whole Church in response to Hitler and the Nazi regime, which goes beyond an often traditional understanding of peace being assisted with pacifism. He offered the gathering a question that is still relevant to our world today: how will peace come? Who will call us to peace so that the world will have to hear, so that all peoples may rejoice? 2. Bonhoeffer rejects the effectiveness of refuting acts of war through the engagement of secular ideals on pacifism. Such actions will not suppress war. He is affirming that peaceful rearmaments will not be effective because war cannot be morally justified. War cannot create peace. Instead, it can only create destruction. Therefore, the Church must passionately advocate against acts of war to reveal the world as good, a goodness that was initially established and declared by God at the dawn of spoken creation. Bonhoeffer believes that the Christian Church's answer to peace and goodness is rooted in God's commandments. As such, God does not exempt humanity from obeying the commandments, and therefore, any transgressions that occur against God's commandments will be held accountable to them by God. Bonhoeffer powerfully addresses the question of what the Church and the individual Christian shall do: believe in God and be obedient. But to the secular pacifism the Church answers, the motives of our actions are not the welfare of humanity, but obedience to God's commandments. The individual Christian cannot do it when all around are silent. He can indeed raise his voice and bear witness, but the powers of this world stride over him without a word. The individual church, too, can witness and suffer, oh, if it only would. But it also is suffocated by the power of hate. Only the one great ecumenical council of the Holy Church of Christ over all the world can speak out so that the world, though it gnashes its teeth, will have to hear, so that the peoples will rejoice because the Church of Christ in the name of Christ has taken the weapons from the hands of their sons, forbidden war, and proclaimed the peace of Christ against the raging world, too. Bonhoeffer is boldly calling on the Church and the individual to be an affirmative voice against all acts of war. Within Bonhoeffer's context of history, the Nazi regime assimilates itself into the Church as an entity of the state. The Church is allowing itself to conform to this faction. The Christian Church must boldly and unapologetically advocate a strong voice against war. Bonhoeffer is proclaiming that if the Church would boldly announce that it would not be assimilated in such a manner, it would provide adequate resistance to foiling the Nazi movement and therefore be an advocate that correctly promotes the divine act and intent of peace. The danger of the Church remaining silent on matters against war is that if it is not opposing such absurdities of violence, it becomes the surrogate of death. The Church inadvertently, in its complacency, was a steward in the act of genocide. By not taking the stance of defining peace efforts, they become destructive agents of the state. A clear example of this was the act of the Church providing the Third Reich with membership records. In doing so, they were actively participating in the recruitment of those in concentration camps. Chapter 2: The Church's Role in the Genocide in Germany 1940s. As Nazism rose to power in Germany, the 45 million Protestants, most of whom were Lutheran, Reformed, or United Church, began to fracture. 3. Protestants in Germany were divided by religious doctrines and practices and by political ideologies. Some churches publicly opposed the Nazis, while others regarded themselves as neutral. However, some actively embraced Nazism, referring to Jesus Christ's stormtroopers. 3. As a result, some of the Protestant churches responded to National Socialism. In contrast, others fought to maintain their church's independence from the state's politics, while others attempted to establish Christianity as the prominent faith in Nazi Germany. The Nazi regime brought about significant changes to Germany's Protestant churches. To begin, the Nazi authorities backed the German Christian movement, a group of Protestants seeking to unite Christianity and National Socialism in a direction that would reject all those deemed unclean and embrace all real Germans in a spiritual homeland for the Third Reich. 3. Moreover, the Nazi leadership wanted Protestants to combine all regional churches under the centralized direction of Ludwig Müller, a well-known pastor and member of the Nazi Party who was designated Reich Bishop. Numerous Protestants in Germany supported these developments, believing that they could continue to follow their faith while also showing support for Hitler by supporting the German Christian movement through Müller. In July 1933, a national ballot of Protestants voted in favor of the German Christians that Müller would lead. This German Christian movement reformed German Protestantism to fit Nazi racial ideology. Instead of categorizing individuals as Christians or Jews based on their faith, German Christians began categorizing people based on race. Church leaders and parishioners whose ancestors had converted from Judaism to Christianity were now considered Jewish, thus prohibited from holding public office. In the winter of 1934, Müller vowed to purge the Protestant churches of all Jewish influence. The sentiment of the National Socialist regime can be summarized in the national slogan, "One Nation, One God, One Reich." 3. While not all Protestants in Germany agreed with the German Christian movement, the confessing church did not protest the majority of Nazism's principles. 7,000 of the nation's 16,500 Protestant clergies openly supported the confessing church. Their opposition was limited to protecting church doctrines against Nazi encroachment. 3. Dietrich Bonhoeffer opposed the Nazis' policies more broadly. In April 1933, he expressed sympathy for Nazi-era Jewish victims and stated that National Socialism and Christianity could not coexist. Following the Holocaust, a lengthy process of acknowledging Christian churches' inability to resist National Socialism and their involvement in spreading anti-Semitism began. There is currently a substantial corpus of literature on interfaith concerns and post-Holocaust theology and ethics. Christianity's history during the Holocaust has also impacted and influenced the burgeoning field of study on religion and mass violence in a worldwide setting. 4. The Church's refusal to respond to the atrocities occurred not out of ignorance. Instead, the Church's shortcomings throughout this era were the lapse of unity on a divine vision and a determination to resist the regime. Chapter 3. The Church's role in the genocide of Rwanda 1994. An examination of how Bonhoeffer's work is still relevant 50 years after World War II. On April 7, 1994, a political assassination triggered the mass killings of thousands in Rwanda. Hutu extremists massacred hundreds of thousands of Tutsis and their sympathizers. Within 100 days, at least 800,000 people were killed in the most rapid genocide ever recorded. The world watched idly while Rwandans were left alone by the international community to face this dark chapter in their history. The ethnic divide and hatred that fueled the genocide did not come from nowhere. It has its roots in Rwanda's colonial history. The genocide that unfolded was fostered by colonialism. Hutus and Tutsis are two distinct ethnic groups, but they have much in common. They speak the same language, live in the same areas, and adhere to similar traditions. When Belgian colonists arrived in 1916, they favored Tutsis and considered them closer to Europeans and superior to the Hutus. They radicalized the differences between the two groups. They established an official register classifying Rwandans according to their ethnicity and pushed racist theories of the supposed genetic superiority of Tutsis. Belgian specialists in the 1930s classified people according to stereotypical physical features, using craniofacial and body measurements, which led to everyone being given a racial identity card. Disagreements between the majority Hutus and minority Tutsis had grown substantially since the colonial period. These classifications would become instrumental in identifying and killing Tutsis during the genocide. The Belgian government was not alone in advocating ethnocentric propaganda against the Tutsis. The Catholic Church was also accused of working with the Hutu government as active participants in establishing the colonial ideology that created the divide between Hutus and Tutsis. Discrimination gradually led to resentment among the Hutus, culminating in a series of riots, killings, and the mass exodus of Tutsis neighboring countries after Rwandan independence in 1962. Hutus won the country's first elections, reversing the power dynamic. The regime that followed was a staunchly Hutu nationalist, and in the following decades, systematic violence would erupt. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana, a Hutu, was killed after his plane was shot down. Although responsibility for the attack was never confirmed, extremist Hutus saw this as an opportunity and immediately initiated a campaign of retribution. This event sparked the fuel that led to the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people. Extremist Hutus, known as the Akazu, took over key government positions and initiated ethnic cleansing throughout Rwanda in the slaughtering of Tutsis. The United States actively discouraged the UN Security Council from authorizing a more robust deployment, partly due to concerns over cost matters. UN peacekeepers were reduced to a mere 260 after those helping within the peace effort were killed. Years after the Rwandan genocide, former US President Bill Clinton would admit that his failure to act in Rwanda was the biggest regret of his presidency. He offered the lament that if troops had been sent to Rwanda sooner, over 300,000 lives might have been saved. The Catholic Church played no small role in the events that took place in Rwanda. Not only was the Church not a voice of peace and inclusion, the part they played in dividing the people based on ethnocentric prejudices would lead to direct ramifications toward the Church. Several Catholic priests, nuns, and brothers were formally charged, tried, and convicted for participating in the genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and a Belgian court. This is more than a theory or rumor. In November 2017, Pope Francis made a pardon plea to the Rwandan people, confirming the Church's active involvement. Pope Francis apologized for the Church's role in the massacres and pleaded for forgiveness for the sins and failings of the Church and its members, and how the Church's involvement disfigured the face of the Church. 1. Chapter 4. Bonhoeffer today in a world where nationalistic sentiments in the United States is at an all-time high. Bonhoeffer's ethical writings are highly relevant to our contemporary cultural. The kingdom of grace is just as much at odds with the kingdom of nature today as it was in Nazi Germany or colonized Rwanda. Sociological individualism continues to grow in the American church, along with the unity of one's faith in conjunction with nationalism. Although it may not seem as apparent to us today as the past atrocities of World War II, we should be aware that it was not obvious to many that horrendous acts against humanity were about to erupt in Germany or Rwanda. The Church is often just as silent today on not being an active voice against war. And many are affirming nationalist sentiments that are reminiscent of the past events shared in this reflection. The Church would do well to consider and adopt Bonhoeffer's work calling the unity to stand in solidarity with Christ on the cross and the ethical involvement of laboring alongside Christ in the reconciliation of all creation. The Church is perpetually mute in Bonhoeffer's call for its vocal opposition to the war. On the contrary, many Christians are calling for violent acts of aggression, hoping to temper in a new age of peace that is confused with safety. It would be prudent for us today to consider Bonhoeffer's statement that peace is the polar opposite of security. That peace must be risked, and that safety can never be guaranteed. It would seem that Bonhoeffer would understand most Christians today as timid, fearful, and self-righteous. As a result, there are many Christians acting out of such fear, who declare that science is an enemy of the kingdom of grace. In doing so, they act contrary to the gospel call by promoting harmful abuse against God's created world. They deny climate change, ridicule medical advances, and actively campaign against human equality in employment, healthcare, and housing. Christ has been nationalized in the image of our ethnocentric capitalist society by those who seek to protect themselves by retreating from the gospel invitation to illuminate God's proclaimed goodness in creation. The divisions that erupted during Donald Trump's presidency are enormous and complex. Some elevated their allegiance to the former POTUS to that of a divine presence or prophetic voice offering the empty promise of salvation. This split is complicated further by many arguing that Christian teachings support the truth and convictions as universal morality. The previous president fanned this charge by promising to elevate the country to unmatched magnificence. Make America Great Again bears an uncanny resemblance to Hitler's primary subject of re-establishing Germany's past greatness. Hindsight is 20/20, but if we do not learn from our past, we are destined to repeat it. Reflecting upon Bonhoeffer's call for the Church to be an absolute voice against all forms of war is a daunting task. Many feel that such lack of agency would only lead to oppressive forces having an even stronger foothold in the engagement of acts of violence and injustice. But if we consider Bonhoeffer's understanding of two kingdoms, in the evaluation of the past events listed in this presentation, there is a strong argument to be made on how effective such a call could be. The hope of this presentation is to offer the observer a reflective approach to the influence and powers of the Church. For better or for worse, it is important to be aware of the great persuasiveness the voice of the Church holds. It is up to us to decide how this power will be wielded. Will it be a unified voice of worldly security flickering in the wind of ethnocentric municipalities? Or will it be willing to venture into the gospel call of radical peace? One can only imagine what would have happened if the Church had applied such peace ethics into practice. We can only speculate. However, may we consider and perhaps even agree, that the actions or lack thereof that occurred in Germany and Rwanda should be unilaterally accepted as a failure by the Church in its gospel call of reconciliation. On the contrary, the actions that took place by the Church greatly fueled ethnocentric attitudes grounded in the faith of one's religion, helping to clear the conscience and justifying those in the almost unimaginable violent act against humanity. It can only be left to one's imagination on how effective Bonhoeffer's model would be. But it seems clear that following his theory would keep the Church from being an agent of death and destruction. The Church has undervalued the power that it has in its proclamation. It may not have the means to supply military ramparts in the form of physical artillery. But what it can do is much more powerful. The Church can create the justification of individual and national superiority that not only eases the conscience of the pursuer. It also has the power to implement a moral foundation that advocates for horrendous acts of violence as a means of being a righteous instrument that has been ordained by God. Again, the hope of this presentation is to offer the observer a reflective approach on the influence and powers of the Church. It is important to be aware of the great persuasiveness the voice of the Church holds. It is up to us to decide how this power will be wielded. Will it be a unified voice of worldly security flickering in the wind of ethnocentric municipalities? Or will it be a voice that is willing to venture into the gospel call of radical peace that opposes any and all means of militance that aid in the instruments of war? It is up to the Church and its members to decide. In the end, it's up to you.